Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it happens to be while you're watching. My name is Matt Doyle. I'm a UK-based author and occasional voice actor, and this is my Cabinet of Curios, the show where we look at horror media that is, at least in terms of the UK, a little bit unusual or a little bit obscure or sometimes just plain underrated. The one I'm looking at today is maybe a little bit of a mix of all three, and that is the 1974 zombie movie Sugar Hill, or if you only saw the cut-down TV version, The Zombies of Sugar Hill. Now, this was made by American International Productions for a very small budget of $350,000. Now, American International Productions had some experience with horror. They actually did the series of Blackula films. And it's part of the blaxploitation movement of movies and films. And what I find interesting with that is that in terms of the UK, it was a lot less impactful. It was very Hollywood-centric. And the result of that is that if you ask someone in the UK what blaxploitation cinema was, it's more likely that they're going to say it was a genre rather than a movement, and they will give you examples like Shaft or Dolomite or Superfly, because this is what a lot of us kind of just thought it was. Whereas in reality, of course, it just covered a lot of different genres, from gangster to action, drama, comedy, and of course horror, which is where Sugar Hill comes in. The interesting thing with Sugar Hill is that it's kind of mixed in terms of how well remembered it is. If you were to ask for a list of someone's top blaxploitation horror movies, it will almost definitely be in there, because it certainly has its fans and it does have a little bit of a legacy with that. If you were to ask for a list of their top blaxploitation movies overall, it's maybe a little bit more 50-50, depending how long the list is and who's obviously compiling it. But if you ask them for a list of their favourites or the best zombie movies, it becomes a lot less likely that it's going to fit into that canon. And I do think that's a shame, because it's not as bad a movie as some would have you believe. For example, it did appear on Chez Faz, which is a German TV show, which was Die schlechtesten Filme aller Zeiten, or The Worst Movies of All Time. It was basically a German show that was based very loosely on MST3K. Much the same thing, taking bad movies and commenting on them in a comedic fashion. Much like Gorgo and MST3K, I do think it's a little bit unfair in this instance, because while Sugar Hill is very cheap and nasty at times, it is still, in my mind, a very entertaining film. Before we get into what goes on in the film, we'll talk a little bit about the cast, because they had kind of mixed luck after the film, and only 2 of the prominent cast members are actually still with us, and their journeys have been very, very different since Sugar Hill finished as well. But starting with the sadly past actors, we did have Dom Pedro Colley plays Baron Samedi in the film. He is the member of the cast with like the longest filmography before Sugar Hill. He'd appeared in Bill Cosby and Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and he had a very good career after Sugar Hill as well, right up until he died. The lead gangster, Morgan, is played by Robert Quarry, who you may recognise from a plethora of horror movies, both before and after Sugar Hill. Most prominently for me is Dr. Phoebes Rides Again, where he featured opposite the legendary Vincent Price. Zara Cully plays Mama Matrice, the old, aging voodoo woman. She was only in a few things after Sugar Hill. Most prominently, she was in a TV show called The Jeffersons for several years, where she had a very prominent role. The gangster Fabulous is played by Charles P. Robinson. He was very successful right up until he died. He appeared in things such as House and Key and Peele, and he had a long-standing role in the series Night Court. The only 2 main cast members that are still alive are Marky Bay and Richard Lawson. Richard Lawson plays the pseudo-love interest Valentine, who's a cop in the movie. He has been very successful. He appeared in Poltergeist, Streets of Fire. He's still acting now. You know, he's going to be featuring in a drama series on Netflix that's coming out around Halloween, I think, called Beauty in Black. Opposite him was Marky Bay, who played the titular Sugar, and she didn't really go on to do a huge amount after Sugar Hill. She did appear in an episode of Charlie's Angels, an episode of Starsky and Hutch, but for the most part, that's kind of it, and she's really known for this role in particular. I don't want to degrade that, though, because I do think that she was, well, the cast in general, I think, are very good in this, at least in terms of ones who have the larger roles. But I think Marky Bay deserves a lot of credit for how she played Sugar. Because at the start, for like the first maybe 20 to 26 minutes of the movie, she's flitting between this very straight, typically 70s performance and a bit of melodrama. You know, like when she finds her fiance has been beaten to death, you know, she has that very over-the-top sort of, you know, no type reaction. You know, we're not quite getting to like kabuki levels of melodrama, but, you know, you could dial it back quite a bit, to be fair. But to a degree, that's almost expected, because there is this kind of idea, I think, that with blaxploitation you're going to see a lot of melodrama, and that does hold true depending on, obviously, what you watch. But after she's spoken with Baron Samedi and the zombies have been summoned, she changes tone in the performance quite a bit, and she becomes more permanently straight-laced in it, and at times very cold. And it really works for what she's doing and the context of her role in the movie. I think that deserves a lot of credit, because that sudden switch, it's almost a very on-the-nose indication of she's gone from this normal person to now all of a sudden her life has been just cut like that. And it's flipped something in her, and it's pulled out the worst in her. And she's going to be taking revenge on these people that very much deserve it. And that is generally the idea of the story. You know, this is Sugar's fiancé runs a Haitian-themed bar. The mob are trying to buy it out from him. He doesn't want to sell it, so they beat him to death. She goes on a revenge trip where she speaks to Mama Matrice and then gets to go meet Baron Samedi and summon the zombies and make a deal with him. And then the zombies are there to help her carry out her revenge, even though they're not actually used directly in every single kill, but they are always there. Let's talk about the zombies first, because the zombies are one of the things that people often point to with this as a sign of how cheap the film is. And to a degree that is fair, especially if you're more used to modern portrayals of zombies and, you know, the changes we've had in special effects since the 70s. So, you know, now you see a lot more of like the hanging jaw and the open wounds across the chest and things like that. But this was a very low-budget movie from the early 70s. And the zombie design is kind of more of a throwback to the 30s and 40s. So to put it in context, it's less Walking Dead, more original Night of the Living Dead. There's a very basic makeup job done. Some of it, they've got some body paint on, like down the chest, and it goes over certain body lines. And I have a feeling it was maybe meant to make it look like you can see the, you know, sort of the bones pushing against the decayed flesh, but it really just kind of looked like body paint. I may be wrong. It may have been intended to be body paint. If it wasn't, it still kind of works contextually, because obviously there's a voodoo theme to the movie, and the stereotype of voodoo was always that like whited out skull-like face and things like that. So it does kind of work. There is a prominent use of cobwebs. One zombie in particular that turns up quite a lot. And by the way, sadly, the version I have of the film, the zombies, none of them are credited in terms of who played them. And I think it's a real shame, because even if they are just kind of glorified extras, they did obviously put a lot of work in with this, in terms of trying to make themselves menacing. So I would have liked to have seen that there. But I digress. The zombies, one of them is covered like from the top of the head down in cobwebs. And it's kind of nonsensical that they've pulled themselves up out of the ground and the cobwebs have completely remained intact. No, those are some badass spiders with some really, really hard cobwebs for that to happen. But at the same time, visually, it's a very nice look, and I do like it, even with the silliness of it. The eyes I really love. It is a very cheap effect, but what they've done is the eyes they have this completely black, shiny feel to them. These are zombies that there's no chance that they're having like memories of their past lives or anything like that. You know, there's no trying to get through to them like you'll sometimes see in more modern pieces. These are zombies that are under control of the Lord of the Dead, of Baron Samedi. And I kind of, to me, the eyes, I may be overthinking this, by the way, so, you know, do take that into account here. But to me, the way they're blacked out, it's kind of like, you know, eyes are the window of the soul. And if they're completely blacked out and shiny and reflective, you know, they're reflecting the will of their master. They are in someone else's control. There is nothing else of them left. That is how I view it, and it really makes the effect seem perhaps better than it actually is when you do that. As I say, the zombies are not involved in every kill. You'll see a couple of different things happen here. You know, they decapitate one of the mobsters. You don't see the decapitation, of course, because it's a very cheap movie from the early 70s, but you do see the aftermath of it when they find the head. So, you know, there's that. There's that first attack is actually what begins to give away to the police that there's something unusual going on, because their early forensics are going into the investigation, and they find dead cells on the zombie, and they go through this very, you know, scientific sounding conversation about it, to talk about, you know, how cells work and what this indicates, and how this indicates that whatever killed him was already dead themselves. And, you know, it's nice. It's not entirely like the most accurate scientific thing you're ever going to hear in a movie, to be fair, but it doesn't need to be. It does its job of showing why the police officer that is investigating this, Valentine, suddenly has this very strong sense that there is something more to what is going on, and that kind of feeds into his eventual investigation, where he goes to like the voodoo museum that happens to be in the area, and things like that. Now, when it comes to some of the other gangsters, some things you're going to see, for example, I actually thought it was quite harrowing moment where one of the gangsters is lured out into the countryside and he's eaten alive by pigs. And obviously, again, it's not like you're seeing pigs sort of like nom 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 and then pulling back like the intestines or anything like that. You know, you're not going to see that, but there's a very frenetic video of like the pigs sort of coalescing in this area and like running around, and there's all the noise and the screaming, and it does enough to set your mind going, you know, and leave you with that sense of, I know what's happening, and seeing it in my head is far worse than anything I would have seen if they'd shown it on the video. So that was very good. There's moments with voodoo dolls, which, of course, again, are the very stereotypical thing that you will see in anything that's portraying voodoo as a very menacing thing. There's a very kooky moment where someone is attacked by a possessed chicken foot, and that is exactly what it sounds like, and you can guess how terrible it looks, and you would probably be right. But they finish him off by putting him again alive in a coffin full of snakes, which, even though you don't see what actually happens to him, you get a sense of it, just enough for it to be what it needs to be. My favourite of the kills was probably the gangster Fabulous was choked to death by a zombie in a massage parlour. And what I really like about this is there is a sense that a big part of blaxploitation is the sleaze. You know, it's a very sexual movement in terms of a lot of the very popular films. So you almost expect there to be a lot of sex. With this particular character, that's the indication of what he's going for with the massage parlor. You know, he's wanting the whole happy ending, and he's got his, you know, attractive masseuse who will normally do the job for him, and Sugar's paid them off to make sure that she can get in there and do what she needs to. It's almost a sort of a subversion of that theme, because the one character that tries to engage in that moment that you almost expect to see ends up dead as a result of it. And I really kind of like that. In the end, the zombies attack Morgan and his sort of, I don't want to say lover Celeste, because the tone of the relationship between them in the movie is kind of, it's a little bit darker than that. He's very controlling and not really interested in her. You kind of get the impression that he probably does engage in things with her, but just because he feels like it, not because he has any particular love for her. They go to visit Sugar when they're the only ones left, and Celeste is left with the fate of being traded to Baron Samedi as payment for helping Sugar, which he already has 2 undead brides with him. So this is a woman being forced into marriage with the Lord of the Death, which is, you know, that's kind of a problematic theme, but it does make sense. I'll go into that in a little bit. Morgan himself, the head gangster, who, again, one of the really standout performances in the movie, he ends up drowning. Like sort of falls into this little swampy thing, and there has been mention of it being a swamp before, but the way he's sort of like, and then slowly sinking, I wondered if it was meant to maybe be quicksand, but it's more just like mud floating on the water, and he's slowly gone down. So I wonder if that was maybe a misstep with the effects, or if maybe I'm just misreading it and it is supposed to just be a swamp. Now, what I said about Celeste, it's made a point of in the movie that the area where Baron Samedi summons the zombies from was actually a mass burial site for, because it's horror, of course it's a mass burial site, but it was a mass burial site specifically for slaves that didn't survive the journey over from Africa. So when the zombies come out of the ground and you start just seeing like that classic hand up through the earth, you know, what you see is the slave shackle. It lingers to make sure that you see the slave shackle on the wrist. And these are, Baron Samedi has a line where he says, slave to master, master to slave. And I actually thought that because blaxploitation can as a movement be a very political type of film, I thought that this was probably a very intentional thing. It feels to me like there is a comment being made here that, you know, these were slaves to white people who were trying to bring them over to do their hard labour. And now their new master is Baron Samedi, and they are going to be going up against, other than Fabulous, all the gangsters are white, right? So it's kind of a turning the tables a little bit. And it's the same thing with Celeste. You know, she's obviously well off. She's from that sort of family that probably would have potentially owned slaves back in the day, and now she is going to be enslaved by Baron Samedi, who is, of course, a black character. So I think that there's it's very on the nose, but I think it is there as a political statement. There is a moment at the start of the film that I want to mention because it made me laugh out loud, unintentionally, I think. The film opens with a voodoo ritual, and they have a chicken that's throat has been cut, and they're like holding it upside down and like dripping the blood into the bowl. But the chicken is very clearly alive and very confused about being held upside down. It's kind of like, what's going on here? And I thought, well, this is cheaper than I was expecting. And then it turns out it's not a real ritual at all. It's just it's a stage performance at the Haitian bar, because specifically it's Haitian style voodoo. And I love that because it put me in mind of another movie that did the same thing to me, that being the Japanese movie Battle Heater, where there's a scene at the start where a van is flipped and you see it roll, but it's very clearly just a toy van that's like going... And then when it cuts back, you realize, oh no, I'm mistaken. That's not just a cheap, crappy effect. That is actually a toy van that's been knocked over. Okay, right, I get that now. So I really want to give it credit for that. But overall, Sugar Hill is a film that I think is well worth watching. It's not particularly long, 91 minutes or 83, I think, if you see the cut-down TV version with the longer title. And it is very cheap. You need to temper expectations with it because you're not going to see anything here that's really stand out in terms of, being ahead of its time with the effects or anything like that. What it does have, though, is what was for me an unexpected amount of quality to the performances. As I say, all the prominent cast are actually very, very good for the most part. There's a couple, like some of the more minor gangsters that are just very, it's the sort of thing that you'd expect to see a gangster played like in most eras. It's very straight-laced, it's very simple as a performance, but it works for what it is. But the story it's something that, while it isn't in itself anything unusual, or, again, much like the effects, it's nothing really standout, it's played so well, and it's a very tidy tale that doesn't try to do anything more than it needs to. Even the sort of pseudo, romance angle with Sugar and Valentine, all you really get is Valentine's steps towards the truth. You see that they had the past relationship, you see the flirtation, and then when it comes down to it, Sugar makes sure that Valentine is hurt but not killed. She just has him taken out of the picture so that he doesn't interfere with what's going on. So it's kept to a very non-intrusive part of the story that still humanizes. It serves that role of humanizing. Valentine is kind of the force for good in it. Sugar is the person who's now gone off the rails a little bit, but with the way she is with Valentine, you kind of see that she's still human. She still has that sense of right and wrong and good morals to a point, but she is treating the bad guys the same way that they treated her. It's worth it seeing that seeing the voodoo, for example, portrayed as it still has that typical sort of, this voodoo is dark magic, and this is something that we're bringing the dead to back to life. It's portrayed in kind of the same way as it would be in, say, Live and Let Die, the James Bond movie, but because it's being wielded by Sugar, and we've got to see why she's doing it and the morals of why she's doing it, that gives this nice twist of taking this dark, scary thing that, especially back in the 70s, people would have been looking at and saying, this is bad, this is terrible stuff, and seeing it used for an understandable reason. Even if you don't want to go as far as saying it's being used for good, it's being used for revenge for something terrible. And I think that's a really nice twist on things to see. So, if you have seen Sugar Hill, let me know what you think of it in the comments below. And please also recommend some more blaxploitation horror movies, because I'll be honest, this was the first one I'd actually watched all the way through. Unless you want to count Live and Let Die bizarrely as a blaxploitation movie to begin with, and more sort of blaxploitation horror, I don't know why you would. But unless you're doing that, I've not actually seen any others. I'm familiar with some of the titles like Blackula and Blackenstein and Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde and Abby, but I haven't actually seen too many of them. So please do recommend some to me to hunt down, because this was a really fun first time watch for me, And I would love to see more and see, you know, how that end of the movement progressed as time went on, and, you know, what else is out there. So, until next time.